61 years ago today, Doctor Who's very first episode was first transmitted. Audiences were introduced to the first ever Doctor, William Hartnell, who continued to enthrall viewers until October 1966. In the final moments of the 10th planet, the one and only Doctor collapsed to the floor and transformed into a whole new man. 1 week later, Patrick Troughton became the second Doctor, and the show's future was ensured. I honestly think we take for granted what a genius conceit regeneration is. Every few years, the show and its main character are completely reinvented, and a new generation of viewers get to fall in love with the Doctor. It's not just a recast. Any long-running drama can swap out a lead actor or replace them with a similar character. Ncuti Gatwa is literally the same character William Hartnell originated 6 decades ago. How wonderful and mad is that? To coincide with Ncuti's first season, I created a 2-part retrospective looking back at each Doctor's debut story. They both did really well, and since it's the big day, and another YouTuber told me to, I thought it would be a great treat to re-release them in a special omnibus edition. I've cut a few bits and added this new intro, but the content is the same. I'm reviewing each Doctor's first story, including An Unearthly Child and the Star Beast, before a full ranking at the end. Like last time, I'm sticking to just TV stories, but if there's enough of a demand, I will do a bonus video covering the transmedia debuts such as The War Doctor Begins and the upcoming Fugitive Doctor box set. Without further ado, let's travel back to May 2024 to talk about a story from 1963. Gotta love time travel. It probably goes without saying that Doctor Who's very first episode is just magical to watch. I watched it recently with a friend who'd never seen it, and seeing her excitement and wonder at the first sight of the TARDIS, the reveal of the console room, and the Doctor's first moments on screen just made me fall in love with this show all over again. It really feels like you're watching the beginning of a legend, but it's still a great simple mystery story that spirals into a Stone Age drama. Ian and Barbara are the first characters to play the audience surrogate role, and are essentially our protagonists in the early stories, with the Doctor and Susan being more mysterious and unpredictable. And while following their student home from school is a safeguarding nightmare, it's a great setup for a pilot episode that very organically transitions into science fiction with the introduction of the TARDIS, which Susan apparently named?
I don't understand you, Susan. Well, I made up the name TARDIS from the initials, time and relative dimension in space.
But what about the Doctor? When Hartnell first enters the scene, he's a strange and slightly scary figure. The unaired pilot leans more into this, making him much more antagonistic and frankly just mean. But recognizing this, the televised episode paints him as more mischievous. He's just messing with Ian and Barbara, and Hartnell plays these moments with such a cheekiness and dry wit that immediately makes him endearing. There are some genuinely funny moments between him and the teachers as he casually patronizes them with his advanced scientific knowledge.
You're treating us like children.
Am I? Children of my civilization would be insulted.
He's definitely not the character we've come to know. He's not even referred to as the Doctor until part 3, and that's to be expected since this is basically his origin story. But there's a twinkle in Hartnell's eye that makes it clear the hero we know and love is still in there. A lot of fans don't care for the other 3 episodes, and I used to be one of them. I found the first one really engaging as a kid, and then just lost interest in all the caveman stuff. But revisiting this story years later, I think the Stone Age material is much more effective than fans give it credit for. It never reaches the highs of the first installment, but the atmosphere is great, the conflict with the tribe is intense and quite violent at times, and watching this first ever TARDIS team slowly learn to work together is really engaging. I think there are even some interesting political ideas here, with the discovery of fire being seen as a sign of leadership. Ian tells the tribe that among his people, the Firemaker is the least important person, since everyone can make it. I've seen some fans read socialist themes into this subplot, and it makes for interesting viewing. 3 sets of people from 3 different periods comparing their science and culture. Ian takes the lead here, but the Doctor is still showing early signs of heroism, with the moment where he tricks Cal into revealing himself as a murderer. The cast settle into their roles quickly, and it's easy to see why this original TARDIS team was such a hit. As an introduction to the Doctor, it works well, but largely because it's the beginning of the character. Hartnell's Doctor, as presented in this story, is much more stubborn and selfish than the version we see even just a season later, and that's why it's so effective. We begin with a Doctor who doesn't trust people and is a bit of a trickster who gradually evolves into a selfless, heroic figure throughout his first life. It's seeing the man he was compared to the man he becomes that makes this story so rewarding to watch 60 years later. As a jumping on point, well, the show's still here, so obviously it worked, but I'm not sure I'd suggest it as an entry point for fans of 2024.
It would be fascinating to watch Doctor Who from beginning to end in order, but that's probably not the best approach as a first-time viewer. I imagine most people watching An Unearthly Child today are already fans who want to see the show's very first story, and it works on that level. It's a bit slow in places which may put some modern viewers off, and it's definitely a story that peaks early, but I still find it an engaging, well-constructed serial and essential viewing for any sci-fi fan. And I would urge fans who haven't seen it to check it out, but the actions of a very petty and bigoted individual have made this key part of Doctor Who mythology much harder to find. It's the only surviving serial not available on iPlayer, ITVX or BritBox, so unless you can find a torrent online or something, I'd recommend picking up the beginning box set, which includes the first 3 stories and some cool bonus features. It's the beginning of one of television's greatest legends, and still a rewarding watch 6 decades later. 3 years later, the Doctor's body has started wearing thin, leading to the show's first ever post-regeneration story, The Power of the Daleks. Sadly, Patrick Troughton's debut suffered the same fate as many stories from this time, being either junked or sold by the BBC, becoming one of the infamous missing episodes. For me, if any missing story could be recovered, it would be this one, if only because of its importance to the show's history as the first introduction to a new Doctor.
Since I literally can't watch the real story, I instead watched the 2016 animated version, which I'll be using for visuals in this section.
As an introduction to regeneration, it's not crystal clear what's happened to the Doctor. The description he gives of the process is quite different from the concept we've come to know a dozen regenerations later. He simply claims to have been renewed by the TARDIS, implying this is an artificial phenomenon rather than a Time Lord ability, and his clothes have changed with him, which is just as confusing as it was in 2022. The new Doctor is a bit of a quiet schemer, rarely giving straight answers and seems to enjoy confusing his companions Ben and Polly. David Whittaker's script cleverly uses their characters to reflect how divided the viewers would be by the Doctor's sudden change. Polly sort of gets it immediately, while Ben isn't convinced and remains skeptical until a Dalek confirms the Doctor's identity. Viewers in 1966 were probably feeling the same way, confused, frustrated, and maybe even a little sad at the loss of Hartnell's character. So representing this polarization within the show itself was a smart move, keeping the companions as a source of familiarity to ease viewers through the transition. Speaking of the new Doctor, I can't fully judge Patrick Troughton's first performance since so little footage of it survives, but I love this characterization. A trickster playing the fool while also being more personable than his predecessor. He's fascinating to watch as he casually brushes off his renewal, confronts the Daleks, and plays mind games with the people in the colony. By the halfway point, you're pretty at ease with Troughton as the Doctor, with the rest of the story continuing as any Doctor Who story would. The Daleks are the real stars of the show here, and this is one of their best outings yet. Posing as humble servants to the people of Vulcan, they don't even speak for a long time and are especially eerie with their blank, unreadable stares.
They can never truly be as scary as they were to viewers in the 60s because of how absorbed they've become by popular culture, but there is something quite creepy about them here.
In the same way that HAL 9000 is creepy, there's nothing human to read, all you have is a largely monotone voice and an unblinking eye. When they do speak, we not only get some great iconic sequences, but also some genuinely funny moments where their mask begins to slip.
You know, it's amazing. You have an almost human interest and curiosity.
A Dalek is not the same as a human.
That bit really cracked me up on this rewatch.
They're a formidable threat, and with Dalek Mania still fresh in audiences' minds, having them return to usher in the new Doctor was a genius move, and I think it's especially important that they recognise him, cementing them as an enemy throughout all the Doctor's lives. But a returning monster begs the question of whether Power of the Daleks can still be enjoyed as an entry point to the series. By nature of it being the first post-regeneration episode, it does require some background knowledge for context. But since Ben and Polly are not only new to regeneration but are also strangers to the Daleks, they work well as audience surrogates, until Polly disappears in the middle. And at this point, the Daleks and regeneration are so widely known that someone watching this in 2024 could probably still follow it. In terms of selling the viewer on this new Doctor, Troughton's stranger, sillier, but just as heroic incarnation manages to win you over very quickly. The hand-waving away of renewal allows the character and the narrative to just move along, not dragging the story down at all. And maybe that's why Power of the Daleks is such a good Doctor debut. It's a great story that just so happens to introduce a new Doctor. A new Doctor for a new decade, Spearhead from Space is the biggest stylistic shake-up the show had had. Gone were the monochrome alien worlds, and in came the dazzling Technicolor, grounded invasion stories, and Fleetwood Mac?
Even when I knew it was coming, hearing Fleetwood Mac in Doctor Who always takes me off guard.
It's arguably the first attempt to completely relaunch Doctor Who, with only the TARDIS, UNIT and the Brigadier continuing into this new status quo. And even then, the Brig is introduced in such a way that seeing his previous appearances isn't required.
In fact, I only checked out his first appearance in the Web of Fear during the research for this video. Yes, I'm a fake fan.
But all around, everything feels new, making Spearhead a great jumping on point and a great place to begin dipping your toes into the classic series. Among these new things are the Autons and the Nestine Consciousness, which are such great monsters. It's the classic take something ordinary and make it scary formula that the best Doctor Who aliens follow, and they're especially creepy here with those blank eyes and the cold performances of the Autoplastics crew under their control. In many ways, this is the first proper post-regeneration story, in the sense that it lays down the blueprint that future stories would continue to follow. The Doctor staying in bed for episode 1, a bit of slapstick hijinks, and even the Doctor stealing clothes from a hospital, which becomes something of a running gag in future episodes. The regeneration process is still kept vague, and it takes the Brigadier some time to come to terms with the idea that this erratic, action-oriented man is the same person he met in the 60s. Possibly 70s, but I'm not going down that rabbit hole. While he is the main character, we see the Doctor through Liz Shaw's eyes, and she's immediately endearing with how the Doctor quickly takes a liking to her. But let's finally talk about the third Doctor. John Pertwee starts as a more aloof and mysterious character, wanting after his shoes, taking showers, nicking clothes, before finding himself and becoming a more grounded, protective personality. As a viewer, you feel like he will look after you, and we see that he can hold his own in a fight, something we hadn't really seen from the Doctor up to that point. He's a lot of fun to watch, but you get the sense John and the script are still finding their feet with this new incarnation, trying to figure out how he'll talk and behave. But strangely, changing almost everything about the show makes the Doctor's regeneration a little easier to swallow. Even the ending, setting up the idea of the TARDIS being stranded and the Doctor's new position at UNIT, establishes that this will be a very different Doctor Who than what viewers have come to expect. When I began writing this section, I felt a little underwhelmed revisiting this story, finding it a lot slower than I remembered. It was only when I started collecting footage for this video that I realised what a well-constructed story this is, with each individual episode having a standout moment. It's well paced with just 4 episodes and plenty of action, and it's a fairly simple story which might have been a result of the production team looking back at the last 2 Doctor debuts with their more complex narratives and ensembles, and looking to usher in this era with a more straightforward invasion story.
I'm a bit behind on the Troughton and Pertwee years, so this transition doesn't hit me as hard as it might have done. Yes, I'm still a fake fan.
But overall, with a great new monster, minimal ties to the show's past, and the beginning of an intriguing new status quo for the series, Spearhead from Space is an impactful debut for Pertwee's Doctor. With regeneration finally given a name and a full explanation in Planet of the Spiders, the 4th Doctor emerges in the form of Tom Baker, the actor who nearly 50 years on is still considered by many the definitive portrayal of the character.
Before getting into the story itself, I have to stress, as cliche as it is to say, it is astonishing how quickly Tom settles into the role.
When I showed Robot to my sister when I finally got hold of the Season 12 Blu-ray, we turned to each other less than halfway through Part 1 and agreed on how instantly perfect Tom is. This restless, wild-eyed bohemian just bursts onto the screen and plays it like the part was his to begin with.
And maybe that was the key to Tom's success. He played the part as though no one had played it before him, and yet retained all the great characteristics of the previous Doctors.
He has the unpredictability of Hartnell, but retains that protective quality Pertwee brought, while also having comic timing on par with Troughton, and that booming voice allowing him to instantly own every room he's in. He just arrives fully formed with all of his quirks and eccentricities there from the beginning. The scene where he chooses his costume is given more importance this time, with an extended comedy montage, and I think most effectively, his very first Jelly Baby scene is used as a way to comfort Sarah after the robot is destroyed, reassuring both her and the audience that despite his quirks, this new Doctor will always keep her safe. Rather than introducing a new tone for the show, this story is almost a send-off to the unit era, with the organisation only returning for a handful of appearances in Tom's run. It still feels like a continuation, and I like that the cast isn't given a chance to rest or adapt to the Doctor's regeneration. The plot just keeps moving, and as soon as he's picked a costume, the Doctor just carries on business as usual. We'd seen the Doctor being restless after regenerating before, but here it's established as just part of his new personality.
Is it a hot take to say that I prefer the Brigadier with the 4th Doctor than the 3rd? I just think his madcap personality's a funnier contrast.
Sarah Jane, played by Elizabeth Sladen, witnesses this regeneration, and yeah, she's still wonderful. She holds her own against UNIT and the think tank, even delivering a great jab against their conspiracies.
Well, we're covering a number of fringe organisations, and I'm sure we'll find a place for you. Somewhere between the Flying Saucer People and the Flat Earthers.
And she forms a sweet King Kong-esque bond with the K1 robot. The titular robot is a great costume design and has deservedly remained an iconic image from this era. The plot is another simple one, but still very engaging, with themes of extremism, the dangers of science, and even what it means to be human, all the while being a fun blockbuster romp. With its fully formed characterization of the Doctor, great cast, and entertaining sci-fi narrative, I think Robot is a solid introduction to the Tom Baker era. Although it picks up immediately where the previous story left off and follows characters from the previous era, except Harry, who makes his first appearance here, it successfully reintroduces the show using familiar elements and a bold, wonderful new lead actor. A great start to the most iconic Doctor of the classic series. After an unprecedented 7-year run, Tom Baker finally bowed out after saving the universe one last time from the Master. And so Peter Davison was the Doctor, even starting this cover tradition for Doctor Who magazine. Just don't look too closely at that cover text.
They misspelt my name, Jeremy.
This story concludes a loose Master trilogy, starting with Tom's penultimate and final stories, The Keeper of Traken and Legopolis. This doesn't overly hurt the story as a jumping on point, since the 3 chapters only share a villain and the loose thread of introducing Tegan and Nyssa. If you joined here, it wouldn't hurt to check out the last 2 stories for context, since the characters aren't given a clear introduction for anyone who missed the rest of this mini arc. Arguably, introducing the new TARDIS team at the end of the previous season frees Castrovalva of the baggage of assembling the new cast of characters. With the regeneration process better fleshed out in recent years, Castrovalva makes the Doctor's change a vocal point of the first 2 parts, expanding the mythology with the idea of post-regenerative trauma and the introduction of the Zero Room. Peter Davison does a great job with this more uncertain Doctor, and I especially like the scene where he impersonates his previous selves as he settles into his new body. It's a fun way to break the ice with the new Doctor, and you can just tell Peter was a huge Patrick Troughton fanboy, since that's the impression he relishes in the most.
Oh dear, we've wandered into the wrong corridor. We must be close to the main TARDIS drive now.
Even selecting a costume is treated with more importance than in previous stories, with the 5th Doctor literally unknitting the 4th's famous scarf, and the music paints the scene where he finds the cricket gear as a pivotal moment, like the beginning of this Doctor's journey. By the end of part 3, Peter feels nicely settled into the role, playing the Doctor as a fresh-faced hero who can't quite command the room like his predecessor.
And that's not a criticism, it's part of his character. An optimistic hero desperately trying to find peace in a universe constantly presenting him with the opposite.
This more tragic element of his character isn't really in Castrovalva, but you do get a good sense of what to expect from Peter's Doctor, making this a pretty well-rounded debut performance. Christopher H. Bidmead's script has a quaint charm to it, nicely setting the story apart from the more somber tones at the end of the 4th Doctor era, while also nicely reflecting the environment of Castrovalva itself, which is a fascinating setting. Unfortunately, the companions feel a little like spare parts here, with Adric being kidnapped and Nyssa and Tegan left to literally carry a sleeping Doctor through a forest. When we get to the titular planet, we get some great imagery, but to be honest, I found myself losing interest in the conflict there. The Master's up to his old tricks and disguises again, and I like how the people of the city turn on him, but he's mainly there just to provide some more conflict to a mostly pretty chill story.
While it doesn't reach the highs of Power of the Daleks or Robot, I still find Castrovalva an easy and fun watch.
The 5th Doctor makes an impact, the effects are a lot of fun, and although I'm not sure how well it fares as a jumping on point, the charm of the script and Peter Davison's performance makes this a bright, optimistic start to the new era.
Okay, this story requires a bit of context.
Usually, the first story for a new Doctor kicks off a whole new season, and this makes sense. It's a big draw and allows for a clean slate so the new actor can spread their wings over the following weeks. But producer John Nathan Turner felt that fans shouldn't have to wait a year to see the new guy in action, so moved Colin Baker's premiere story to the end of season 21, 1 week after Peter Davison's finale.
This was an interesting move, and I can see the logic behind it if the previous story wasn't the case of Androzani.
See, the Fifth Doctor's final story is widely considered one of the greatest Doctor Who stories of all time. In fact, in 2009 it was voted the best in Doctor Who magazine's poll of every story up to that point, and still ranks high in the countdowns to this day. Now take a guess where the following story fell in that ranking. That's right, the exact opposite spot. Imagine the whiplash of watching these two stories just weeks apart in 1984.
Everything's turned from gold.
I've never watched the Twin Dilemma immediately after Caves, which is a luxury the audience in 1984 didn't get.
Viewing this story on its own merits as an introduction to the Sixth Doctor, it's just not good.
Obviously this is subjective, and it feels almost mean to pick on it because I love Colin Baker. I think we all do, he's such a wonderful ambassador for the show, and with how poorly he was treated by the BBC at the time, he has every right to be bitter, and yet has remained a great positive voice in the fandom and is so proud to be part of the show's history. But this is such a boring, misjudged opening story. In contrast with the hopeful and affable Fifth Doctor, the Sixth is a trickier, more cynical character. This era liked to push the idea of the Doctor being an alien further with his fashion sense, mood swings and unpredictable nature. The idea supposedly being to present a hero's journey for him, beginning as the most violent and self-centered version of himself before growing into a selfless hero. But the polarized reaction from viewers forced the series to speed up this character arc, making the Sixth Doctor we see in his second season much more endearing and honestly more fun to watch. I think it's in The Trial of a Time Lord where we see Colin really shine, and I just wish we could have got this version of him from the beginning, because although he excels at the theatricality and the arrogance, the Doctor in the Twin Dilemma is just mean-spirited and kind of annoying. The idea of a regeneration going wrong is introduced here, with the Doctor trying to kill Peri, as well as suffering several violent outbursts. Peri even calls him manic-depressive at one point, and although that terminology is a bit outdated, she's not far off. Even going into this story knowing all the infamous parts, his behaviour is just confusing and not in an entertaining way, giving the story a strange, cynical tone that's distractingly offset by the silly costume design and narrative. The Twin Dilemma's biggest crime for me is just being dull. The conflict isn't engaging, the pacing is poor, and even at just 4 parts, it feels slower than some 6-parters. I think this is because the two major plotlines of a new, potentially dangerous Doctor and some evil slug using 2 boy geniuses for world domination have no real connection to each other. Colin's era does this a lot, where the first half shows the story of the week unfolding alongside cutaways in the TARDIS, and I can't say I'm a fan of that approach. It just slows down the pacing and makes for quite a disjointed first half. So is there any good here? Well, I think the cast do a decent job elevating this material, with Nicola Bryant really being put through the ringer here. Her friend has just changed into a melodramatic weirdo, she thinks he's dead at one point, and she's constantly being harassed for the next season. Her loyalty to the Doctor throughout all of this makes her more likeable, but you do just want her to leave him at some point. Their more playful, cheeky friendship in the mysterious planet is a long way away, leading to quite a heated TARDIS team. Kevin McNally is fine in a largely unnecessary role, and Maurice Denham gives a surprisingly touching performance as the Doctor's old friend and mentor, Asmail. And there are moments where this new characterization for the Doctor really works. I believe his friendship with Asmail, the moment where he casually claims to be able to crack millions of lock combinations is classic 6, and even the final moments of this story are elevated by Colin's performance. He famously proclaims,
I am the Doctor, whether you like it or not.
Which isn't exactly something that would win over your audience, but what I never see talked about is what happens after. The Doctor gives Peri a little reassuring smile, as if he's saying, I know this is weird, but we'll figure it out together. It's a really sweet moment that I think the story needed more of, which highlights the key issue with the Twin Dilemma. It's a poor script, slightly improved by the performances. If more of Colin's real personality was allowed to shine through, the early Sixth Doctor would be much more entertaining.
If not the worst Doctor Who story of all time, the Twin Dilemma is certainly the most infamous, and for that reason it's almost worth checking out just to watch all these weird creative decisions play out in context.
Colin Baker later flourishes into a more well-rounded and interesting Doctor, with his second season and by being further fleshed out in Big Finish's audio dramas. And there are certainly early signs here that Colin does understand the character and has the right theatrical presence to own the role. But with an uninvolving story and an inconsistent, mean-spirited tone, this was not the beginning the Sixth Doctor deserved. But this scene is hilarious.
Villain!
Following the disappointing reception to Colin Baker's second season, delayed by an 18-month hiatus by BBC controller Michael Grade, producer John Nathan Turner was told that a new season of Doctor Who would happen on the condition that Baker was replaced.
John decided to break this news to Colin respectfully, over telephone, and Colin, understandably angry, refused to come back for a final story or even a regeneration scene.
Side note here, when I saw Colin Baker at a panel in Scarborough last November, he claimed that the latter decision was because he'd already agreed to do a play around the same time, so he couldn't come back to regenerate even if he wanted to. Just thought I should mention that. And so the 1987 season opener, Time of the Rani, introduced a brand new Doctor in the form of Radagast the Brown himself, Sylvester McCoy. Time of the Rani doubles as both a regeneration and post-regeneration story, since the Sixth Doctor's death opens the first episode, although he's still played by McCoy. And here's a funny detail: since it's never explained what triggered the regeneration and the exercise bike that Mel forced the Doctor to use in Terror of the Vervoids is in frame, fans assume for years that the Sixth Doctor died from falling off and hitting his head on the console.
I fell off an exercise bike. Is that how I went?
Thankfully, Colin finally got a proper, dignified regeneration scene in the 2015 Big Finish release, The Brink of Death.
But what about the story itself?
Tonally, this is a breath of fresh air after the mean-spirited tone of much of Colin's era. The Rani makes her first and, so far, only return to the series, as she kidnaps various geniuses throughout the universe to build a time manipulator to rewrite history, including Oppenheimer's own Albert Einstein. I know Einstein probably deserves his own dedicated historical story, but I kinda love that he's just there and the story carries on as normal. To trick the Doctor, the Rani disguises herself as Mel Bush, and does a surprisingly decent Bonnie Langford.
Perhaps the machine exploding affected my memory too. Doctor, what were the readings?
All that gives you the vibe of what this story is like. It's weird and pantomime and definitely not for everyone, but I found it refreshing to have an opening adventure that captures the silly fun that Doctor Who can indulge in. It's almost a hodgepodge of different classic Who cliches, from the quarry planet, the silly costumes, and the distinctly 80s music and effects. Despite this, I found the story quite slow on this rewatch, and I don't think it holds up particularly well to repeat viewings unless you're really in the mood for a bit of campy sci-fi. But what about the main man himself? Although the more layered characterization of the Seventh Doctor as a manipulative mastermind is developed much later in his run, I still quite like Sylve's early performances. This Chaplin-esque madcap scientist leaps onto the screen and completely gets the material. He has great chemistry with Bonnie. I love how his post-regenerative trauma is played more for comedy than the melodrama of the previous story, and by the end you want to see more of him. Speaking of Bonnie, Mel is, well, Mel. She seems to be a bit of a Marmite character among fans, but since she's returned in the current era, this computer scientist and fitness obsessive has had a bit of a reassessment. She's definitely a more capable character than she's given credit for, but her best material is when she finally reunites with the Doctor. She perfectly matches the vibe of this story, and honestly, I'm happy to see her back in 2024. As an introduction to the show, it's more mixed. There's no real explanation for who the Doctor is, and even with the amnesia plot point, the script still assumes the audience knows about Mel and the Rani without a refresher. But as an opener to season 24, this sets the tone perfectly. Colourful, silly, and a bit mad, that's pretty much the early 7th Doctor era. But in almost an inverse of what happened with Colin, the 7th Doctor begins as a comedic figure and suddenly becomes a scheming mastermind. So in the context of who this character becomes, Time of the Rani isn't the best representation of McCoy's Doctor. It's fun, and there's certainly a charm to it, but I didn't find myself as involved as I was when I first watched it.
And for nearly a decade, that was the last time we were introduced to the Doctor, since in 1989, Doctor Who came to an abrupt end.
There were rumours of a new series, a Hollywood movie, and even an actor who randomly claimed to be the new Doctor starring in a couple of pilot episodes, but there's no record of them existing, so let's be honest, he probably lied. But there was one man in particular who was determined to resurrect the show, Philip Segal, a producer for Steven Spielberg's own Amblin Entertainment.
And the early 90s saw several rejected scripts, casting sessions, and constant arguments between British and American producers until eventually, for one night only, the Doctor was back. And it was about time.
The 8th Doctor's first and only full on-screen adventure is a bit of an oddity in Doctor Who history. Despite clearly being a continuation of the classic series, it was also intended as a backdoor pilot for an eventual revival, so makes many changes to the lore and has a distinctly different look and feel. Stylistically, it's always reminded me of the X-Files, especially since it's mostly set at night in a big American city. Plus, the dynamic of a skeptical redhead and an eccentric believer in the impossible feels a bit familiar. But it also has some surprisingly deep cuts into the lore, with the Eye of Harmony and the 12 Regeneration Rule being pivotal to the film's narrative. It's often criticised for overloading new audiences with continuity, and while the opening moments certainly suffer from this, and a few references later that feel like the filmmakers picking out fun facts from the show's Wikipedia page, I think making the regeneration a central plot point was a smart move. Writer Matthew Jacobs explained that he felt that when introducing the Doctor to an American audience, making the Doctor's central journey one of self-discovery would put viewers on a level playing field with the main character.
The story is essentially Doctor Who Am I, allowing the audience to understand the Doctor at the same speed that he comes to understand himself.
This film is carried by Paul McGann. He's just wonderful here, bringing a wide-eyed optimism and youthful energy to the role. I love his random name-dropping of historical figures, his Britishisms turned up to 10, and I completely believe this is the same man viewers had followed for over 30 years. Even fans that don't like the movie collectively agree that Paul is great in it, and I would have loved to see this hopeful, passionate Doctor continue in a full series. The 8th Doctor has changed a lot over the decades through his various Big Finish stories and writers developing his personality further, but that essential optimism and charm are all there from the beginning. Even having Sylvester McCoy return for the regeneration scene feels right. Yes, it's a shame his Doctor didn't get a true finale on screen, but having the 7th Doctor back to hand over the keys of the TARDIS allowed McGann's Doctor to be a true addition to the lore. He wasn't a rebooted Doctor for the American viewers, he was our Doctor regenerated once again. And producer Philip Segal had to really fight for McCoy to make an appearance. Higher-ups wanted Tom Baker to appear as the Doctor in the film's first act. Well, that would have messed the numbering up to no end. Like Castrovalva before it, the movie pits the new Doctor against a new Master in the form of Eric Roberts, who delivers one of the campiest villain performances in the show's history, and I love it.
I always dress for the occasion.
It's a little hard to reconcile this Bruce Master with his previous incarnations, but he's just right for this big, ridiculous blockbuster premise. I even love that he gets his new body on the same night the Doctor regenerates. It reminds me of how the Green Goblin's origin and Spider-Man's are intercut in the first Spider-Man movie, and that's the sort of tone I think this is going for, with some bold imagery like Grace running through the hospital in an opera dress, the broader visual comedy, and this line that's clearly for the trailer.
This is a movie, and if you allow yourself to go with it, you'll have a great time.
Daphne Ashbrook is a good match for Paul's Doctor, although I'm not sure I buy the romance between them. And Yi Ji-So makes for a decent companion of sorts to the Master, with some pretty funny banter between them. The plot is mostly straightforward, although there is a lot of technobabble that I'm not sure I fully understand in the climax. It's well directed by Jeffrey Sachs with some great imagery, one of the eeriest regeneration scenes in the show's history, and a great soundtrack. As an entry point to Doctor Who, it's a strange one. There's plenty of lore introduced, and some of it is well integrated, but there's probably too much of it to grab new viewers. I think the film should really start with Lee finding the TARDIS, establishing the Doctor as a mysterious figure who can cheat death, and saving the reveal of that gorgeous TARDIS set until later. The fact this film never led to a full season means it stands out more as its own entity. The 8th Doctor fans currently enjoying comics, novels and audio dramas is quite stylistically removed from his origins in this film. Even the half-human thing this film introduced was completely ignored by the series itself, probably because Russell has admitted he doesn't like it. Many saw it as the last shot at a revival for the show. Obviously this didn't go to plan, but now we're nearly 20 years into the actual revival, this story can just be enjoyed on its own merits now there's none of that added weight. It's an entertaining TV movie with a great central performance and plenty of comedy, action and romance to keep you invested.
As an introduction to the show, it's very flawed, but as a different take on the series 30 years into its run, it's a fascinating watch and gifted us with an excellent new Doctor.
During the wilderness years, fans who'd loved the show as kids were now grown up, and some were even working in television. 3 of those kids were Chris Chibnall, Stephen Moffat, and the writer of this first episode, Russell T Davies. Known for revolutionary dramas like Queer as Folk and The Second Coming, Russell always wanted to write for his favourite show, and had his first series cooking away in the back of his mind for many years. And in 2003, Doctor Who was finally announced to be returning to screens with Russell at the helm. The following year, Second Coming star Christopher Eccleston was unveiled as the 9th Doctor, and a year after that, the Doctor finally made his fantastic return.
Rose is a relatively simple story, but it's clear just how much thought went into how to introduce the Doctor's world to a modern audience. Instead of opening on an alien planet or overloading audiences with mythology, Rose begins in a normal world of traffic, buses and shopping. It's far removed from what many viewers expect from the show and immediately establishes the grounded contemporary tone Russell was aiming for. The classic series was unavoidably steeped in middle-class BBC English, something the revival wanted to avoid, with distinctly working-class characters and a Doctor who talks less like a man from another world and more like a very smart guy at the pub. The essentials of Doctor Who are slowly introduced and recontextualised in this modern setting, with Rose asking if anyone else knows about the Autons especially standing out to me on this rewatch. This one-take walk from the Powell estate is a great moment of exposition and character dialogue, outlining the rules and basics of the show without the need for callbacks or continuity. While the TV movie made the mythology integral to its narrative, Rose largely ignores the previous 40 years and instead confidently marches forward into the 21st century. Even the returning Autons are never named on screen, and the moment when the nesting consciousness calls the Doctor a Time Lord is very easy to miss. This is Rose's episode. Almost every scene is from her perspective, it's her journey we follow, and in this first series, she's arguably the real star of the show. She's immediately set apart from previous companions with a fleshed out family life and her young age, making her the perfect audience surrogate in 2005. She takes some cues from Ace with her age and class, but the image of these screaming companions still lingered in the minds of viewers, which is likely why Rose's journey takes centre stage. She doesn't connect with me as much as other companions, but I completely understand why Billie Piper's performance captured the public's imagination back in 2005. Suddenly, this dusty, impenetrable sci-fi show was centred on a normal young woman, allowing a generation of children to enter the TARDIS through her. The Autons are lovingly recreated and modernised with great costumes and creepy sound design. Shop window dummies springing to life and killing people works just as well 30 years on, and it's honestly surprising they haven't had another dedicated story since. This also leads to the greatest Doctor Who monster of all time, Plastic Mickey.
Don't think that's gonna stop me.
The London setting feels bustling, alive and tangibly real, adding a level of believability while putting to rest the old wobbly sets cliche. But how does the Doctor translate to this modern setting? Christopher Eccleston has been open about his personal issues with the production and seems unsatisfied with his performance, but I honestly think he's great here. Like Tom Baker before him, he arrives fully formed and beaming with charm and a commanding presence. He has a great wit, his outbursts feel natural, and he carries all the essential ingredients of the classic Doctors while making the part his own. It's not just the northern accent, but the unapologetic "this is who I am and what I do" attitude, and some of that upper-class authority figure stripped away. I love how he effortlessly delivers technobabble, and his chemistry with Billie is already great, establishing the Doctor and Rose as equals. Unlike previous Doctor debuts, this isn't explicitly a post-regeneration story. He's clearly regenerated recently, since he takes a moment to comment on his new face, but it's evident a lot has happened since his last appearance in 1996, and this was absolutely the right approach. Opening the Revive series with a fully formed Doctor freed this episode from the baggage of dealing with those post-regeneration hijinks, and allows Chris's Doctor to be more mysterious and intriguing. I didn't see this story go out live, which I'm honestly kind of sad about, because it's such a big part of history. It's the beginning of a modern British institution. Emotionally, it doesn't hook me like other episodes, and I think the iconography of it all makes it a little hard to judge objectively because of how ingrained it is into popular culture. But there's no denying how efficient this is as a mission statement for the revival. It's carefully scripted, well performed, and kicks off the series with confidence and style. The Doctor is back, and the trip of a lifetime has just begun. After a reportedly tense 9-month shoot, Christopher Eccleston decided to step down from the role. Luckily, Series 1 was such a resounding success that new Dr. David Tennant joined a show that was already a hit with audiences. Announced only weeks into the new series, despite initial plans to keep the regeneration secret, more on that here, the 10th Doctor made his full debut on Christmas Day 2005 in the first of many festive specials to come. And although it's currently so bright outside I can barely see the screen I'm writing on, let's talk about Christmas. Introducing a new Doctor during the festive season was a smart decision. TV is a big part of Christmas for a lot of families, so launching Tennant's Doctor on the day itself ensures a big opening night. It may walk like an alien invasion movie, but the holiday setting makes it feel even grander with Santa robots, killer trees, and the whole nation brought together by an alien threat. The Doctor being bedbound nicely raises the stakes and allows the Sycorax to be a more menacing threat. When it comes to one-off monsters, they're definitely up there with a brilliant design and the mix of medieval and sci-fi in their technology. I also love the twist with their masks and their grotesque appearance under them. Continuing Davy's more grounded approach, Rose's reaction to the Doctor changing is the emotional through line of the story. I like that her unspoken feelings for the Doctor are acknowledged, with her taking his regeneration more personally than previous companions. Her breakdown halfway through nicely mirrors how new fans might have felt being introduced to this concept for the first time. I love seeing the Tylers and Mickey trying to save the day without the Doctor, with Rose even trying to be him as she name drops the Shadow Proclamation like he often does. But they're not the only ones fighting off the Sycorax, with this story also closely following the British government led by Harriet Jones. Penelope Wilton is as great as ever, and I love her deadpan delivery of some of these lines.
You seem to be talking about aliens as a matter of fact.
There's an Act of Parliament banning my autobiography.
The government and Guinevere 1 scenes lend a different perspective to the invasion and allow this Christmas Day attack to feel more significant and believable. But what about David Tennant's first performance? All these years later, he rivals Tom Baker as the most popular Doctor, and it's clear why he was such a hit. He's so much fun as this swashbuckling adrenaline junkie who doesn't always recognise the danger he puts people in. But unlike Tom and Chris, I don't think David's Doctor arrived fully formed. He's still figuring the character out, and plays it a bit madder than we'd see later on, which he still does well, but the 10th Doctor's personality develops so much throughout his era that the version of him we end the Christmas invasion with isn't quite the one we'd see in future stories. I'd argue it's not until The Girl in the Fireplace or even the Series 2 finale that both David and the team have fully worked out the character, as he's put in more challenging stories and settings. But that's not to knock his first full outing. Coming into the story in the last act, David enters with a real swagger, and giving him a big hero moment with the duel against the Sycorax was a great way for him to win over Rose and the audience. It's quintessentially Doctor-y, but feels specific to this Doctor. The no second chances scene is played a little too fast for me, but it's an important part of his character that does come back many times. His brutal takedown of Harriet Jones also demonstrates that he's much quicker to anger than his predecessor, and has a real dark streak when challenged. Conceived as a standalone special, it's pretty accessible to new viewers, I think because the threat is so earthbound and relatable. Any recurring characters are nicely reintroduced, there's a great new monster, and we end with the promise of more adventures. David even takes a page out of his future father-in-law's book by repeating the catchphrase of a previous Doctor.
And it is gonna be fantastic.
It could probably do with a bit more David since he's in bed for most of it, but this nicely builds anticipation for when he finally emerges in the finale. While his characterization is in its early stages, there's plenty of room to develop across the next season. It's one of the strongest festive episodes thanks to a movie-sized conceit and a holiday setting that feels integrated rather than a mandate. The Christmas Invasion is another hit for the series, proving that the 2005 revival was here to stay. And staying power it had. The David Tennant years saw the show reach record viewing figures and critical acclaim, with Doctor Who back in the hearts of the nation. But in October 2008, at the height of his powers, David announced live on television that he was stepping down for the 2010 series.
When Doctor Who returns in 2010, it won't be with me.
A few months later, Matt Smith was announced as the 11th Doctor via a jump cut on Doctor Who Confidential.
So you know how I didn't see those first 2 stories live? I mean, also the previous 8, but in my defense, I wasn't conceived when those went out. So naturally, I don't have the same connection to them that many other fans have. I began properly watching the show at the tail end of the 2009 specials, and tuned in New Year's Day 2010 to watch David Tennant regenerate. I think what I'm trying to say is...
My turn, assholes!
The pressure on Matt Smith was insane. He's been pretty open about the anxiety he went through, hitting his pillow at night in frustration and even calling his dad 2 months into filming when the nerves kicked in. When he was first announced, fans and tabloids immediately started judging him. He's too young, he's not David. Matt even had people in the streets telling him not to break the show. Now, obviously Jodie and Ncuti have faced more intense backlash from those kind of people, but it's still important to recognise what a challenge the Series 5 premiere was. In just an hour, Matt Smith and new showrunner Stephen Moffat had to convince fans, general audiences, and even some people at the BBC the Doctor Who could continue without its flagship star. I'm saying all this to illustrate how astonishing it is that despite all that hype and baggage, the 11th Hour bloody worked. This is easily the most confident debut so far simply because it makes it look effortless. Stephen Moffat has woven one of his sharpest ever scripts, with every scene brimming with character, great dialogue, and a dozen key plot points and setups. Every time I watch it I notice something new, and I've seen this story a lot. I own 3 versions of it. Hell, Series 5 was the subject of my dissertation, where I analysed the series through the structure of classic fairy tales, which was the tone Moffat was going for. Opening with a young girl making a wish and a magical box landing in her backyard, there are clear echoes of the line The Witch in the Wardrobe and Tom's Midnight Garden, immediately distancing the show from the contemporary realism of RTD. The whole thing feels magical, and it's a testament to the writing and the performances of Smith and Caitlin Blackwood that this story of a strange man befriending a young girl doesn't seem creepy. This fairy tale vibe even stretches to the show's visuals, with some beautiful cinematography in Amy's garden and Adam Smith's stunning direction. Even the simplistic design of the monsters feels consistent with this storybook feel, with both Prisoner Zero and the Atraxi resembling kids' drawings or something out of Monsters Inc. Before starring in the highest grossing films of all time, Karen Gillan was lighting up the screen with this cynical, adventurous Scottish girl in an English village. She instantly clicks with Matt, and while she definitely has flaws as a character with how dismissive she is to Rory, Series 5 is essentially her coming-of-age story, and we see her overcome these flaws over the following episodes. The scene with the apple where she begins to accept the Doctor is her imaginary friend is just beautiful, and reflects that rekindling of childhood imagination that's at the core of this season. Having Amy meet the new Doctor as a child first was also a great idea. To her, he's always been Matt Smith, and because of the story she's built around him, she has the same mythic view that the audience has. He doesn't have to convince her he's the same man, he just needs to convince her to believe in impossible things again, like a time traveller who fell from the sky and likes fish fingers and custard, which I have tried because I am indeed that sad. Arthur Darvill is instantly lovable as Rory, and the cast is surprisingly star-studded, with Olivia Colman, Nina Wadia, Patrick Moore.
Oh, I like Patrick Moore.
I'll get you his number, but watch him, he's a devil.
And even the voice of Pingu. No, really. But let's finally discuss Matt Smith. God, he's good, isn't he? Matt just arrives fully formed as this mad adventurer with a childlike wonder for the universe. His quirks feel natural, he carries himself with what can only be described as a calculated clumsiness, and yet also shows great compassion to Amy and her younger self. He's literally running around in the tattered remains of Tennant's costume, and yet completely owns the role, to the point where you practically forget the character was played by someone else a few months earlier. He just gets it, completely understanding Moffat's take on the character, and makes the part his while still taking some cues from the past. He does such a good job with this that I didn't even notice he repeats one of David Tennant's most famous catchphrases at one point.
What? Come on. What? Come on!
What? That doesn't feel like a callback, it feels fully integrated into his performance, and for as widely discussed as his age was, his youthful appearance honestly adds to all this. Matt was only a few years older than me when he shot the 11th Hour, terrifying I know, and yet I completely believe he's a centuries-old man with a young man's face. Moffat once described him as a young man built by old men from memory, which in itself is magical. I've used that word a lot, and that's because this story really is magical to me. I'm completely engrossed every time I watch it. I laugh at the funny moments, I'm moved by the heartfelt moments, and by God, I'm always pumping my fists at that scene on the hospital roof. Despite being confined to one small town, this story still feels grand and epic, and Ledworth is very fleshed out in this one episode. I just love this delightfully boring British town where everyone knows everyone, and Amy's imaginary friend is a local celebrity. It's relatable yet still very idyllic and picture book. As an introduction to the show, this is a great place to start. The 11th Doctor's era saw Doctor Who find a huge audience in America, so for a lot of international viewers, this was their introduction. It's just the right length, with each scene advancing the story, and the conclusion is greatly satisfying and exciting for a season premiere. I had just started my journey as a fan when I first watched it, and this was the perfect gateway into the Whoniverse. I may have liked Doctor Who before the 11th Hour, but I loved it by the time those credits rolled. Matt's whimsical, nerdy Doctor and his friendship with the girl who waited immediately captured my imagination, and I quickly ran out into the garden reenacting all the scenes and making up my own adventures. 14 years later...
14 years!
14 years since Fish Custard.
This is still a brilliant hour of TV and a bold, unapologetic mission statement for the new era. Despite everything working against them, Matt Smith and the entire creative team delivered a debut story that masterfully reinvents the show and somehow made it look easy. In the middle of the 50th anniversary year, Matt Smith announced he would be stepping down after the commemorative specials in the winter. 2 months later, in a live show I still haven't watched to this day, seriously, put it on iPlayer, Peter Capaldi was unveiled as the 12th Doctor, leading to about a year of these kind of videos.
Hordes of robot. Life is interesting at last. I've been so bored for the last 2 years.
The 2014 series was surrounded by leaks, rampant spoilers, and even a world tour. Finally, just before I started high school, Deep Breath premiered on BBC One and I was on holiday. Don't worry, I watched it the night I got back. Revisiting this story nearly a decade later, I'm kind of underwhelmed by it. While the 11th Hour has a sheen of confidence, Deep Breath feels weirdly insecure, like it's genuinely worried about fans not warming to this Doctor. And understandably, Peter Capaldi was a very different leading man to what many modern viewers were used to with his older age. It might be hard to believe given how beloved Peter's Doctor is in 2024, but there was a real concern around his age and if the show could still connect with younger viewers.
I hope he's a good actor because he's not hot. I'm not okay with that.
Shut up!
This uncertainty is reflected through Clara. Since she was clearly developing feelings for Matt Smith's Doctor, losing him is a huge shock, and she's not even sure she wants to continue travelling at one point. Series 8 attempts a similar arc to what was intended with the 6th Doctor, where he begins as a more difficult and morally ambiguous character before finding himself in the finale. So it makes sense 12 doesn't fully settle in until later in his run. Even with this foreknowledge, this series opener feels very slow and uneven. The comedy's hit and miss, and the script feels padded to fit the extended runtime with an especially slow first half. Even individual scenes don't feel as polished, with the veil scene being a great example of a solid concept that doesn't fully translate to the screen, and I'm not sure what it's saying, if anything. The story doesn't truly come alive until the restaurant scene. Jenna and Peter hit it off with electric chemistry, the clockwork droids are genuinely threatening, and the episode culminates in a pretty satisfying finale. The droids are completely reinvented from their previous appearance in The Girl in the Fireplace, with some great practical effects and embracing the body horror. Peter Ferdinando's half-faced man is a chilling villain, and I like that his constant rebuilding and losing himself mirrors the effects of regeneration. The sequence of Clara holding her breath is genuinely scary, with the drawn-out echoing score and Jenna Coleman's performance. It's a standout story for Clara, with some of her bravest and most powerful moments in which Jenna excels. As divisive a character as she's become, we should always remember how lucky we were to have such a talented performer on the show, and Jenna has rightfully gone on to great things.
Ben Wheatley, who directed one of the weirdest horror movies I've ever seen a year earlier, impresses with a very good looking episode, but there are some really weird moments of editing with abrupt cuts and unnecessary slow-mo and a pretty ugly grade on a lot of the scenes. Maybe it's meant to represent the smogginess of Victorian London, but it results in some very artificial looking scenes. Peter Capaldi is easily one of the best actors to ever play the Doctor. There are signs of great things to come, especially in his confrontation with the half-faced man and his excitement realising he's Scottish, but I don't think this story was the best place to introduce his Doctor. Some of the comedy feels out of place, with Peter fitting the dry wit much better, and while he's more developed by the end, this is only the beginning of his journey. Overall, he's given plenty of standout moments and lines and has a real command over the screen, but Peter's best stories are yet to come. 12 changed a lot over his 3 seasons, with the version of him we got from late Series 9 onwards easily being my favourite. In comparison, this early characterisation doesn't feel as fleshed out, and the script is clearly still finding its feet with Peter in the role. But I love his delivery, how scary he is at times, and even his little James Bond moment, making it clear that we have a very special Doctor here. In a first for a Doctor debut, we get a cameo from the previous incarnation, with the 11th Doctor calling Clara shortly before he regenerates. This scene tends to divide people, with some seeing it as taking the limelight from Peter, but for me, this is very effective. For one thing, Matt's Doctor employed time travel like a superpower, so seeing him bend the laws of time once again to comfort his friend is very touching. But on a metatextual level, it's literally and figuratively the previous Doctor approving of the new one. It's made abundantly clear that they're the same person, and I especially like the moment where the 12th Doctor explains his frustration that Clara won't see him as the same man. It's the kind of scene the twin dilemma desperately needed, and makes for a lovely bookend to the episode. As a jumping on point, Deep Breath isn't very accessible. Tonally, it's very different from the previous seasons, but retains much of the core cast and continuity, so there's less of a clean slate like with the 11th Hour. Clara's grief and the admittance that there was some romantic attachment between her and the Doctor also requires a full season of context to appreciate. The presence of the Paternoster gang also feels a little misleading for an opening episode, since they don't return at all in Peter's tenure. 2017's The Pilot, on the other hand, was conceived as a new episode 1, so is arguably a more fitting introduction to 12's era. Overall, Deep Breath gets a lot right, but with an inconsistent script and poor pacing, it struggles to fully utilise its new Doctor, despite an entertaining second half. Not the worst, but a real step down from previous debuts. In 2017, Jodie Whittaker made headlines across the world when she was unveiled as the 13th Doctor. And of course, the internet responded to this very normally.
It's going to be shit. I'm officially done. Bye, Doctor Who.
I think it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. It makes me very angry.
A lot of red angry faces.
That all just looks like straight up BS.
We should bomb the BBC studios. What's wrong with people?
Yeah, the Jodie Whittaker era of Doctor Who under showrunner Chris Chibnall has become one of the most divisive periods in the show's history. But then again, so was the Capaldi era when that was airing, and now it's been reassessed as a golden age, so maybe the same will happen here. Sadly, casting the first female Doctor and a move towards a more diverse team in front of and behind the camera meant the show soon became a target for reactionary outlets and public figures. We had YouTubers spinning racist conspiracies, an MP linking Jodie's casting to stabbings, and talk radio having to break Ofcom regulations to complain about the show. The past few years have not been a fun time to be a Whovian, and for all the valid criticisms of the Chibnall era you can make, I think this manufactured outrage driven by bigots to make the show a culture war talking point did more harm to its popularity than anything the series itself did. And I hope this doesn't become the 13th Doctor's legacy, because I honestly enjoyed these seasons. Definitely not as much as previous series, but I always had fun tuning in on a Sunday night, and I appreciate this change in pace for the show. And this opening story is an especially fun start to Jodie's tenure. Contrary to what historical revisionists will have you believe, The Woman Who Fell to Earth was a big hit with audiences, receiving great viewing figures and reviews, and reinvigorated discussion and hype around the show. I remember talking to so many people who weren't fans who were enjoying her early episodes, and I think this has been forgotten in the sea of reactionary articles and million-hour video essays. Sadly, I don't think Series 11 quite sustained this momentum, but it's worth acknowledging acknowledging that this was a successful relaunch back in 2018, and the 13th Doctor certainly has a big fan following. The new cinematic aesthetic is instantly noticeable, with some great cinematography bringing the Sheffield setting to life. There's a great urban atmosphere, matching the autumnal release date, and it has the right mix of the epic and domestic which all the best Doctor Who has. This story also introduces an ensemble cast, as Chris Chibnall's family ITV drama vision for the series comes into play, and while I don't think the fam were developed enough to justify how long they stayed on, this first episode does a decent job establishing their characters, especially when it comes to assembling Team TARDIS, with Yaz's role as a police officer giving her a clear reason to be on the train and to interact with Ryan at the start. At first, this seems to be Ryan's story, but it organically expands into an ensemble when the characters are united by the Doctor. He's a difficult character to judge, since personally I always got the sense he was written to be younger than he is, and having to perform with a different accent, Tosin Cole can't bring as much of himself to the role. But in this episode, I honestly like him. He's a normal guy struggling with normal things, and I believe his pain and frustration in that final scene on the hill. We also get the Chase's very own Bradley Walsh as Graham, who's more of a supporting role here, but made likeable with his complete disinterest in alien activity and his eulogy to Grace. Mandit Gill is believable as Yaz and strikes up a good bond with the group, although later episodes seem to struggle with what to do with her. The team dynamic really shines here, with each character contributing to the story, and there's plenty of backstory established to develop over the next season. Not all of this comes into play later, and Yaz didn't get much focus in Series 11, but Ryan's relationship with Graham and his dad does get a good payoff in later stories. The Stenza is a solid monster with a great design and accompanying theme, and his wearing teeth is such a fun, grotesque idea. Tim Shaw is essentially a loser among his kind, and seeing the Doctor take the piss out of him is a lot of fun. But now let's discuss the 13th Doctor herself, played by my home slice Jodie Whittaker. I appreciate that despite the endless debate surrounding a woman playing the role, her gender is largely irrelevant. The script wisely characterises her as the Doctor first and foremost, and like her predecessors, she instantly takes charge and marches forward undeterred by her new body. While some of her dialogue feels overwritten, I get a good sense of who she is by the halfway point. She's hopeful, childlike, and filled with excitement and wonder, which Jodie just nails. I love her big hero entrance with that fist-pumping rendition of the main theme, plus a great stunt on the crane. For me, she doesn't settle in as well as previous actors, but I feel like I know the 13th Doctor by the end of the story, and I've always got a smile on my face when she's on screen. Especially after 12, who at the best of times was somewhat ignorant to people's emotions, it's nice to see her go to extra lengths to apologise and ensure her new friend's safety. I don't always believe the technobabble and some of the more gimmicky Doctor dialogue, but I always believe in her wonder, her kindness, and her ability to smile in the face of danger, which is what makes the 13th Doctor so endearing. She also rocks that ragged version of 12's outfit. The family drama element works well with the addition of Sharon D. Clarke as Grace. She's wonderful here, and her death becomes a moving emotional through line through Series 11, with her eulogy being especially heartfelt. It helps to establish early on that the Doctor's lifestyle is dangerous, which gives more weight to the fam's decision to stay with her a few episodes later. There are some clunky moments, with the usual cliche of mention family member before I die being really forced, and the backstory of Rahul and his lost sister which feels unnecessary. Overall, the dialogue isn't as sharp as in previous stories, but Chibnall has a knack for writing great confrontations with villains. Also, how can you not love Salad Man?
Eat my salad. Halloween.
On my first viewing, I wasn't sure what to think. Seeing my Twitter feed ranting that the show had been saved from the previous era felt a little disheartening as a big fan of Moffat's tenure, and Series 11's back-to-basics approach took some getting used to. But subsequent viewings have been quite rewarding, and I appreciate what a good jumping-on point this is. The mythology is kept to a minimum, the word Time Lord isn't even mentioned, and I love the mystery surrounding the Doctor's regeneration and that great cliffhanger. After years of Doctor Who being incredibly lore-heavy with complex stories and arcs, it was time for a more stripped-back version of the show. The Woman Who Fell to Earth does exactly what it needs to. Establish the new cast, sell viewers on the new Doctor while acting as an entry point for new fans, and it's very functional in that regard. It's a fun, atmospheric season opener and a solid debut for the 13th Doctor. And now that I've been nice to a Chris Chibnall episode, leave my comments alone! And we're nearly up to date as we jump to the 60th anniversary and the first of 3 commemorative specials. In a surprise to anyone who wasn't chronically on Doctor Who Twitter, Jodie Whittaker suddenly regenerated into David Tennant in the final moments of The Power of the Doctor. A year later, the 14th Doctor was reunited with Donna Noble to take on a monster from the pages of Marvel Comics. Former showrunner Rusty Davis returned to the show, and with a new streaming partner and a new Doctor waiting in the wings, a bold new era was upon us. I wasn't sure whether to include this story as a Doctor debut because it just doesn't serve the same purpose. Not only have we already met David's Doctor, but we also knew Ncuti Gatwa was set to take over 2 weeks later, so it barely establishes a new direction for the show. The Star Beast has more in common with a legacy sequel like The Force Awakens, revisiting familiar characters as they go up against a new threat. But since it's confirmed in the giggle that the 14th Doctor is indeed a true incarnation and he's officially recognised as a mainline Doctor by the BBC, the Star Beast technically counts. Plus you guys voted for this, so let's talk about it. If you've been watching me for a while, you'll know I have a complicated relationship with David Tennant's Doctor, recognising him as a great version of the character, but often frustrated with the overhyped culture around him and the inability of some viewers and even the BBC to move on from him. So when it was confirmed that David would officially be the 14th Doctor, I was very sceptical. But now the dust is settling on these specials, I can safely say I like 14. The reality of Tennant being older adds new layers to his performance. He's not just 10 again, he's the same character with all the growth of his last 3 incarnations, even overcoming some of 10's character flaws. Rewatching the 10th Doctor era, it's kind of hilarious how bad he is at expressing emotions, often just being stoic and quickly turning to anger in a crisis. 14, on the other hand, is openly emotional, even surprising himself at times.
I absolutely love her. Oh, do I say things like that now?
And an all-around wiser and humbler character. I'm not sure I'll ever be 100% on board bringing back a previous Doctor in such an official capacity, but as a one-off for the specials, David really shines with a new angle on his most iconic character. He's not missed a beat and could probably play this character in his sleep at this point. I also love his new costume, which retains the feel of his original look while also feeling unique and quintessentially Doctor-y. Donna is still a great, multifaceted character, and seeing her happily settled with a loving family is very heartwarming. She finally gets to reconnect with the Doctor and saves the day once again, with Catherine slipping back into the role like no time has passed. The Meep is a fantastic alien with a great mix of practical and digital effects and a hilarious vocal performance from Miriam Margolyes. Even if you know the twist from the comic, the moment they reveal their true nature is just delightfully evil. Having recently read said comic, this is a decent adaptation, taking the same beats and structure but incorporating modern elements like the Noble family. The script has great action and set pieces, but it's hurt by the lack of a clear point of view character. Most stories like this are told through the companion's eyes, but since we already know Donna and are familiar with David's Doctor, there's no point of identification for new viewers. Rose, while brought to life admirably by Espen Finney, feels underdeveloped despite being an obvious choice to lead the episode. If the story was focused on her discovering the Meep and working with the Doctor to help her mum, that would have allowed the special to function better as a jumping on point. This moment especially,
after all these years, I'm finally me,
would also hit harder if Rose was the central protagonist, otherwise it just feels tacked on. Reviewing this story as a Doctor debut feels almost unfair since it occupies a unique place in the Whoniverse. It's an anniversary special continuing a story arc from 2008 that's also technically a third of a Doctor's tenure. There's just too much on its plate, making the introduction of the 14th Doctor less of a priority. As a special, it's an entertaining, nostalgic watch, but with how much it needs to establish and resolve in just an hour, it struggles to be anything more. The focus on characters from the past also makes it an odd place to introduce the show to the new international audience despite the opening recap. I enjoyed it, but it's hard to know what terms to judge it by, and its inclusion here is largely due to technicality. As a Doctor Who episode, The Star Beast is very entertaining, but as a Doctor debut and introduction to the show, it's inevitably compromised. In the climax to the final anniversary special, The Giggle, Ncuti Gatwa's 15th Doctor emerged in the show's first bi-generation. I had mixed feelings about this plot point, more on that here, but Ncuti immediately made a strong impression and I was very excited for his full debut at Christmas.
With the show returning to its Christmas Day slot, this special goes all out with the festivities, opening with a haunting rendition of Carol of the Bells, a snowy churchyard right out of a holiday card, and goblins. I had fun with the anniversary specials, but for me, this was the real start to Doctor Who's new era. No returning characters or monsters, this is a definitive clean slate to welcome new fans. Much like Rose back in 2005, The Church on Ruby Road introduces the Doctor's world through the eyes of a companion, with Ruby Sunday, played by Millie Gibson, being the primary focus. Russell takes some cues from Stephen Moffat's era, with a fantastical storybook opening and incorporating Ruby into the season arc. But making her special doesn't detract from her relatability, as Ruby is still a believable and endearing character thanks to Millie's great performance. She's funny, heartfelt, and the moment where she fights back tears over the phone is particularly effective. Millie is such an expressive performer, making her a great match for Ncuti's flamboyant Doctor. The story also takes cues from Moffat's timey-wimey narratives, with an extended sequence set in a broken timeline, visually represented with a literal crack through Ruby's family home. There are echoes of It's a Wonderful Life, with a glimpse into a world without the lead character, and even Labyrinth, with children being stolen by goblins. Sadly, this Goblin King doesn't look like David Bowie. It's a simple story without the scope of the Christmas invasion, but it feels just right for Christmas Day, and allows for plenty of time to get to know Ruby and this new Doctor. Revisiting all these episodes for this retrospective, I've concluded that only 4 actors arrived fully formed as the Doctor. No actor gave a terrible debut performance, but they either begin as a very different character to the one they eventually settle into, or still feel like they're finding their feet. The 4 Doctors I think immediately settled in are Christopher Eccleston, Tom Baker, Matt Smith, and yes, Ncuti Gatwa. I know it's early days, but come on, who wasn't instantly charmed by that smile, his delivery, his laugh? He's just the Doctor through and through, and the production team struck gold with this casting. Ncuti brings so much of himself to the role while also respecting the legacy of the show. I believe him as a centuries-old traveller who still hasn't lost his appetite for adventure, and he lights up every scene he's in with a magnetic presence. Few Doctors could get away with calling people honey, but my god, he owns it. He excels at the comedy, the exposition, he really is the full package, and I hope this is just the beginning of many more adventures to come. There's even a nice callback to his foresight in the TV movie, when the Doctor knows the future of the police officer, knowing his proposal will be successful. It's a really sweet moment that was apparently added at the request of Disney executives, proving that additional input can greatly enhance a story. The emotional openness of 14 continues with the Doctor quickly finding a connection in Ruby, and he's visibly distraught when she's erased from time. Russell not only takes cues from Moffat's run, but also draws on Chris Chibnall's timeless child mythology. This contentious bit of lore is cleverly woven into the story in a subtle thematic way, giving Ruby and the Doctor common ground, with them both being foundlings. I love how he seems to surprise himself when he realises, possibly for the first time, that he's also adopted. I really appreciate that this facet of lore wasn't just swept under the rug to satisfy fans who wanted everything Chibnall did to be unwritten. Instead, these revelations offer new narrative opportunities and create a special connection between the Doctor and their new friend. Ncuti also plays this moment beautifully. It's very understated, but I love the quiet acceptance of his past.
I'm adopted.
As I explained before, this is a pretty small scale story, focusing on Ruby and her family, with the goblins coming in later. Davina McCall makes her second appearance on Doctor Who and my YouTube channel, and I was fully convinced the episode actually killed her off when I first watched it. The Sunday family is a great unit, with Cherry's never-ending quest for tea.
Where is my blasted tea?
And Michelle Greenidge gives an especially powerful performance as Carla, in both the regular timeline and as the bitter alternate version. Her monologue to the Doctor is surprisingly dark, and plays into the It's a Wonderful Life influences, showing the impact one person can have on the world. The goblins are a lot of fun. I would have liked a few more hijinks with them terrorising London, really playing into the Gremlins vibe, but they're a great mix of practical costumes and VFX, and the science based on coincidence is such a cool concept. The pirate ship in the sky is a great image, the set feels ripped right out of a Jim Henson production, and shoot me, but I like the Goblin song. It's silly and campy, but perfect for the fantastical tone, and it's not like it breaks the universe. It's clearly diegetic, and Ruby's less than smooth rhyming suggests that she and the Doctor are just freestyling. Also, damn, Ncuti's got some pipes on him.
And that's when we start.
there anything this guy can't do? Following on from 2 years of miniseries, specials, and anniversary celebrations, this was the first real jumping on point the show had had in a while, and I think it works on that level. It requires no prior knowledge to enjoy, and conveys the mix of domestic, fantastical stories Doctor Who can tell, while also establishing the Doctor as an enigmatic hero. Ruby serves a similar role to Rose back in 2005, as our audience surrogate, and by the end you're pretty won over by her and want to see her travelling in that TARDIS. It's full of festive imagery and action, including a great hero moment for the Doctor at the church, and the overall tone is bright and welcoming. I'm interested to see how many fans in the future describe this as their entry point to the show, especially with the new audience through Disney+. With 2 great lead performances, a magical Christmassy narrative, and plenty of action and comedy to keep you hooked, this was a great start for the 15th Doctor. And there you go, that's all 15 Doctor debuts done and dusted. Revisiting these episodes has been interesting, and it's given me a greater appreciation of how much the show has evolved to suit the times. There are certainly recurring themes and gags in these stories, but each one feels unique, and there's no right way to introduce a Doctor. I definitely like some more than others, and I don't think each one fully succeeds in relaunching the show, but the sheer variety here made this quite a fun marathon. But now it's time to answer the question in the title of the video. Which Doctor had the best introduction? Now, I'm terrible at picking favourites, so had to resort to using Preference Revealer and a bit of tweaking to finalise my ranking. It was very hard to narrow down a definitive list, but I chose between stories by asking myself questions like, which is a better jumping on point, which story would I rather watch right now, and often, which one do I personally enjoy the most? It would be impossible to rank these stories in a way that would satisfy everyone, but here's my ranking of all 15 Doctor debuts. In last place, to no one's surprise, The Twin Dilemma. I'm sorry, Colin, I know it's an easy target, but the plot is unengaging, the Doctor's characterization is all over the place, and the tone is just so off-putting and cynical. Definitely a low point for the classic series, aside from some decent isolated scenes and performances. At 14, we have Time of the Rani, a significant improvement that does a decent job introducing McCoy's Doctor, but the pantomime tone and narrative kind of depletes its rewatch value. I really need to be in the right mood for this one. Possibly controversial, but in 13th place and the lowest ranking Revived series episode, Deep Breath. I love the 12th Doctor, and everything with the droids and the no breathing is great, but the rest of the episode feels especially clunky and unsure of itself. Coming in at 12th and 11th place are the Star Beast and Castrovalva respectively. David and Catherine are wonderful, and the Meep is a great monster, but since it's more of an anniversary special than an opening episode, it felt unfair ranking it higher, even if it's arguably the more entertaining story. Castrovalva's just vibes, okay? I like Peter's performance, I like that chill atmosphere, it's just nice. Number 10, the TV movie. Paul McGann's One Story holds a special place to me as my first exposure to classic Who, and even if it struggles juggling that American reboot angle with all the lore, I still find so much to love in it. I wouldn't show it to someone to introduce them to Doctor Who, it just nicely stands alone as its own thing. In 9th place, The Woman Who Fell to Earth. A solid start to Series 11 with great atmosphere and an optimistic lead which successfully introduces Jodie's Doctor. Not sure why there's no opening titles. Number 8 is An Unearthly Child. I ranked it above 13's debut because it just has a certain magic to it, you know? That opening episode feels like the beginning of something huge, and the Cavemen stuff is still pretty engaging. Also, I like this mischievous, slightly scary Doctor who also smokes pipes for some reason. The Christmas Invasion comes in at number 7. I love the blockbuster premise and watching the world try to deal with an invasion without our main hero. Also, killer Christmas trees, what more do you want? Number 6 is The Church on Ruby Road. Call it recency bias, but I was very impressed with Ncuti's debut. It's a great mix of sci-fi and fantasy, it's suitably Christmassy, you don't need to watch anything else to enjoy it, it's a solid introduction. Seriously, give this one a rewatch if you didn't click with it back in December. And starting our top 5, the beginning of the revival itself, Rose. It does everything it needs to do, it packs a lot into 45 minutes, and it's the reason the new show is still running 20 years later. At number 4, The Power of the Daleks. That creepy atmosphere, the Daleks at their most formidable, and Patrick Troughton is wonderful. I'd love to see this story return to the archives one day, so we can properly judge his first performance. Number 3, Spearhead from Space. Doctor Who jumps into dazzling Technicolor with a story so memorable that writers are still taking cues from it to this day. It's exciting, action-packed, and launches the show into a new age of action and earthbound adventures. but number 2 has an ace up its sleeve, Tom Baker. Robot is so much fun. Spearhead arguably tells the stronger story, but I love this little sci-fi romp and Tom just dominates every scene he's in. Sarah Jane is great here, the Brig too, and as silly as it is, I like the conflict with that poor robot. And finally, number 1. My favourite debut appearance for a Doctor to date is, you guessed it, the 11th Hour. The safe choice? Maybe. The popular choice? Yeah. But the right choice? I think so. You guys overwhelmingly voted for this as your personal favourite, it frequently ranks high on other countdowns, and to this day Matt Smith still considers it one of his favourites. But why do I think it's the best one? If I had to narrow it down, it would be that the 11th Hour is indisputably the Doctor's story. We follow him through the early hours of his new life, and the central conflict is whether he can save the day while fighting his own body. If anything, the regeneration is an inconvenience to him, being thrown into the action without the chance to take a breath. Obviously, Amy is also a huge part of this story, and you could view them as dual protagonists, but this is first and foremost about introducing the new Doctor. It's one of the only times where they're the central focus and the main draw. Think about it, the focus of the power of the Daleks is the Daleks. The big draw of the Christmas invasion is the premise itself, the Christmas invasion. Rose kinda speaks for itself, and although stories like Deep Breath and the Twin Dilemma certainly are about the Doctor, the story of the week sort of overwhelms them. The main selling point of the 11th Hour is absolutely come and see the new Doctor in action, but it also balances this with the introduction of a new companion and the monster of the week. Another key ingredient to its success is the confidence evident in every scene. The script, the direction, and Matt's performance are all completely sure of themselves, and yet it is completely accessible to new fans and viewers. A lot of this confidence likely comes from the fact this wasn't the first episode put into production. The Time of Angels kicked off the first block of shooting, while the series opener was shot in a dedicated block. This allowed the cast and creative team more time to settle into their roles before shooting commenced on the premiere episode. This same approach was used in Peter Davison's first season, with 4 to Doomsday being recorded before Castrovalva, and recently Doctor Who Unleashed revealed that 73 Yards and Dot and Bubble were the first episodes Ncuti Gatwa recorded, meaning yes, that ending was the first scene he recorded for the series. Man, that's gotta be rough. Maybe getting all the nerves out on a mid-season story allowed these actors to excel in their first chronological appearance, but I also understand the logic of shooting more linearly. The 11th Hour ticks all the boxes. It's bold, exciting, and welcoming, but still a great Doctor Who episode in its own right. It's the story that made me fall in love with the show, and all these years later it remains, in my opinion, the strongest debut for any Doctor. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed all these reviews, and be sure to leave your thoughts on any of these stories in the comments below. Take care of yourselves, and last but not least, happy Doctor Who Day.